Hello there and welcome back to Hydroponics Daily, your go-to podcast for everything soilless cultivation. I'm your host, Dr. Russell Sharp, the founder of Utrema Limited and a former academic lecturer. And today you could say I'm going back to my roots because we're talking about plant propagation. I used to research plant propagation back when I was a PhD student at East Malling in Kent. And today we're talking about root cuttings, which are a unusual type of propagation that very few people have actually heard of, but is quite useful for a number of different species. So let's look into it because some of these plants are quite interesting. So root cuttings are a good method of propagation for species that regularly produce suckers, but the technique is not exclusive to these types of plants. Root cuttings can also be useful for removing a pathogen that is causing a disease on the foliage of the plant, especially if the cutting is sterilized and then allowed to sprout in an area some distance from the diseased mother plant. So say you've got red spider mites or thrips, then this can be a good way of getting fresh plants that are free of that pest. Now, some plants are great for taking root cuttings from, others you simply cannot take root cuttings from them, and some you get variable results from. Okay, so examples of plants that you can take root cuttings from would be sassafras albidum. Easy for me to say. I think isn't that used in root beer, or was originally, and then it was removed because it was carcinogenic. I think that was it. Devil's walking stick, Aralia spinosa. They're two plants particularly suited to propagation via root cutting. I've got a couple of foxglove trees in my garden. They are the paulownia tomentosa. So they're very, very beautiful. They produce massive displays of purple flowers that my neighbours are very jealous of in the spring. And the closely related Paulownia elongata, which is another foxglove tree, that is the fastest growing hardwood tree in the world. So a really good a tree to plant if you want a tree to get to a good size very quickly. It's the foxglove trees, and they can be grown with root cuttings. Then there are three types of tree where the propagation is quite complicated. So I've talked in the past about cuttings and how the mature plants, once they've flowered, they become really, really difficult to take cuttings from. So once they've had flowers on them, like rhododendron, then the genes that are turned on when they become mature makes it much harder for cuttings to be taken. So you want your mother plant to stay in its juvenile form. Now, if it has become a mature form, for a few trees, you can revert them back into the juvenile form by taking root cuttings first. So the silk tree, which is nothing to do with silk, Albizia gilibrizin, aspen, which is a very popular forestry tree and tree of disturbed habitats, and Georgia plume, then are propagated straight from root cuttings due to the problems of maturity. Instead, root cuttings are first taken and the shoots produced revert to the juvenile growth form. And then you can take shoot cuttings and dramatically improve the rooting capacity. Root cuttings are also useful for hops, whose dioecious sexuality means vegetative propagation is needed to ensure new plants are female and useful in brewing. Could that be used in other plants in the cannabis family? I'm not sure of any legal cannabis work that's been done on root cuttings, but if it can be done on hops, then potentially it can be done on hemp and legal cannabis. For plants that are difficult to propagate by root cuttings, it should always be placed vertically with the cutting orientated the way it was on the mother plant. For plants that are very easy to propagate by root cuttings, such as clematis, another popular ornamental climber, the root cuttings can be placed horizontally in the growing medium, so no need to place them vertically. Placing the cutter horizontally is useful as it often results in more than one plant arising from just one cutting. So if you're a commercial clematis grower, which there are a few are up in Lancashire, I believe, in the UK near Preston, then they probably put them horizontally and then chop them up after that. Now, this is the most important thing when it comes to root cuttings. Unlike stem cuttings, the use of rooting hormones should not be undertaken because the plant is already a root, and then putting an auxin hormone on that is going to promote extra root growth is not what you want. You want shoot growth. And so do not use rooting gels, auxin liquids, anything like that when you're taking rooting cuttings. There will be other potential hormones that could be beneficial. I've not looked at the literature, but there probably are a few, maybe gibberellins, things like this. Definitely don't use a growth inhibitor. And they should be fairly easy to take. Because they're planted into the growing media, you don't actually get a lot of water loss from a root cutting. So it can sit there and stay there. You don't need to worry about dehydration. Just make sure the growing media remains well watered. Whereas a stem cutting, you're always basically just trying to prevent it dehydrating all the time. With a root cutting, it's pretty much take them, plant them, and then wait for them to emerge. So they're a lot easier. Just don't use any rooting liquid. It's important to note if you're growing a variegated plant, if you take a root cutting as opposed to a stem cutting, you can lose the variegation, especially if it's due to genetic chimerization. When these chimeras we've talked about, when grafting curiosities, there was an episode on that. If you take a root cutting, you can lose that. Talked about pests and disease. One of the big pests you can lose by taking a root cutting, free your plants of a pest, is the nematodes, the stem nematodes in phlox. And so phlox plants are root cuttings are very useful in phlox, and they're the routine way of doing it because you can remove the stem nematodes that parasitize the plant by doing that. And then finally, the last thing to say about root cuttings is that if you do take them off a plant in outdoors and then bring them inside, your mother plant may suffer damaging effects because of that. It can reduce the hardiness of things like foxglove trees if you root prune them and remove roots from them, especially as these root cuttings are normally taken fairly late on in the season, closer to the winter, and so they might not be hardy. So just bear that in mind. Be really interesting to know if anyone has taken hop cuttings from root cuttings, because that's something we're looking at doing. Something we're doing at the moment. We're growing hops in our grow room. We've got about 10 plants now, but I'd like to get more and more. And they're not looking too healthy at the moment. I'd like to improve them, increase the number of that we've got. And so maybe rather than taking stem cuttings all the time, when we separate them, we could take some root cuttings. Be interesting to know if they're successful, because the hop growers we speak to, and there are some of our best and most enthusiastic customers, they struggle to propagate hops, especially their new varieties. New varieties are coming out all the time. And so if we could take root cuttings, that would be a good thing for them. So we'll look into that actively. If you found this episode about root cuttings interesting, then please leave us an Apple Podcast review if you're listening on an Apple device. If you're not listening on an Apple device, on Apple Podcasts, then leaving a review is useless. So the best way to help out the podcast is to check out utrema.co.uk. And if you can't spell utrema, it's Latin for wasabi. And then just stick .co.uk on the end of that. Thank you very much for listening. If you've got any feedback, any comments about root cuttings, then let me know. I think we could do an episode tomorrow on root pruning. That would be a good one. Getting back to the nuts and bolts of horticulture after a few controversial news stories. It's always good, nice and relaxing. Thank you very much for listening. It's been an enjoyable one, and I'll speak to you again tomorrow. Goodbye.